Thank you so much. I am really happy to have the opportunity to talk tonight about how we can enrich modern life by combating stressors. And you don't need me to stand up here to tell you that we live in a stressful world. In fact, when I tell people that I studied the relationship between stressors and health, usually the first thing that people say is that they would be the perfect subject for to participate in one of my studies because they have such high levels of stress. So stress is all around us. Oftentimes we may feel that we're at the end of our rope. We face deadline pressures, we have conflicts with family members, and we have to sit in traffic on the 405. It's also increasingly difficult for us to disengage and unplug from this stressful, hectic world since BlackBerries now beep at all times of the day and night. So stressors are ubiquitous, and we're learning that they can also have a profound effect on our health. 43% of Americans suffer adverse health effects from stress, so this really translates into a major public health problem. And experiencing high levels of stress can lead to the development or exacerbation of a number of different diseases, including cardiovascular disease and depression. So the question then is, what is this link between stressors and health? Clearly this is a complex problem that probably has many different causes. But one way through which stressors may impact health is by causing specific biological changes that, if experienced over time, could lead to disease. So we're all familiar with certain aspects of the stress response. So if you're anticipating a heated argument with a colleague, you might feel your heart rate increasing or increases in anxiety. But there are a variety of other physiological changes that are part of the stress response that are less perceptible, and you can't necessarily feel them in the same way. This includes changes in levels of certain hormones or in shifts in how the immune system functions. And collectively, all of these changes that make up the stress response can be considered a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, our stress responses can be very adaptive, but on the other hand, stress responses can be very detrimental. And which way this cuts, whether it's adaptive or detrimental, can depend both on the person as well as the situation. So for some people, performing under mild to moderate amounts of stress or pressure can actually increase productivity and effectiveness. But for others who are maybe less resilient, who don't have the same coping skills or have the same resources, these identical levels of stress may be damaging or detrimental. So whether stress responses are adaptive or detrimental can also depend on the type of stressors people face. So the nature of the stressor itself is very important. And the classic example of when the stress response is considered to be very adaptive is if you're facing a physical threat, like you're trying to escape from a predator. So when the zebra is being hunted by the lion, the physical stress response that includes increases in heart rate and adrenaline and a variety of other physiological changes. These changes provide the energy and physiological resources for the zebra to escape the threat. But this situation is obviously very different from many of the stressors that we face today. So first of all, this is a short-term threat. For the zebra, it either escapes or it doesn't, and then the threat is gone. But our stressors can stretch on for days, for weeks, for months, or even for decades. So the chronicity of our stressors is very different. This is also an acute physical emergency for the zebra. It needs to escape, and the metabolic energy that is released as part of the stress response can help the zebra run away. But the majority of our stressors are not physical emergencies. I'll state the obvious and say we're not usually chased by lions. Instead, many of our stressors are social in nature. So we want to be liked and accepted, so feeling rejected by others is threatening. We want others to value and appreciate us, so feeling like others are being critical, or if we're not living up to their expectations, this is a stressor. My research really focuses on these types of social stressors and whether they're capable of eliciting specific physiological changes. So one way to think about this is I'm interested in whether all types of stressors are interchangeable, or do social stressors elicit the same physiological responses compared to stressors without this social component. Or on the other hand, is there something sort of unique and particularly potent about social stressors that may lead to physiological changes that have these downstream health effects? So we've approached this question through a series of experimental studies. We create stressful environments in the laboratory, so we have participants, college undergraduates, come in and deliver speeches. They deliver 5-minute speeches on why they would be a good job candidate, and we collect saliva and blood samples to assess different physiological parameters before and after the task. But what we do is we experimentally manipulate the social context of the stressor. So some of our participants deliver a speech alone in a room in this non-social condition where nobody else is present. Other of our participants, though, were randomly assigned to a social condition, and 2 of our undergraduate research assistants take notes and observe the participant in a critical and cold manner. And if you are one of our participants in the social condition, this is what you would be experiencing. And while this might be a somewhat extreme and unambiguous situation, I do think that it taps into universal feelings of being evaluated and criticized that one can experience in a variety of different situations and contexts. In my lab, we've been particularly interested in the stress hormone cortisol. Cortisol is an important metabolic hormone that can regulate other physiological systems of the body. And what we find is that when participants in our non-social condition deliver a speech, we see no significant changes in cortisol over time. So delivering a speech alone in a room does not elicit a cortisol response. But when participants deliver a speech, but this time in front of an evaluative audience panel, what you see is this strong, significant increase in cortisol. So it's important to note here that the participants were going through the exact same stressor. So everybody was delivering a 5-minute speech, but only for those for whom the stressor was social. They had this audience present, showed the increase in cortisol. In other studies that we've conducted, we've looked at how the social context influences components of the immune system. And in particular, we've looked at substances called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And pro-inflammatory cytokines are important because they mediate an important type of immune response called inflammation, or the inflammatory response. And so if we look at pro-inflammatory cytokine production before and after a speech task, again, what we see for these non-social, for the participants in the non-social condition, is that there's no significant increase in pro-inflammatory cytokine production. But take the same stressor and add a social evaluative component, and all of a sudden you're getting these strong, significant increases in pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are a marker of inflammation. So across these studies, what we're seeing is that the social context can profoundly shape the physiological responses that we see. So our findings then demonstrate that social stressors in particular can elicit cortisol and pro-inflammatory cytokine activity. So we conducted these laboratory experiments in order to isolate causal variables linking different stressors to physiological changes. What my graduate students and I are now doing is extending this work and examining real-life, naturally occurring stressors and their physiological correlates. So this will allow us to see how these processes play out in everyday life and if our laboratory findings mirror what's going on in naturally occurring situations. So why might this be important then to understand the specific conditions that can elicit cortisol and pro-inflammatory cytokine activity? Well, cortisol and inflammation can have profound effects on health. Inflammation and cortisol dysregulation is associated with the onset and progression of a number of different diseases, including many of which are sensitive to stress. And in fact, some recent research has shown that inflammation is actually as big of a predictor of cardiovascular disease than other risk factors that we sort of think of traditionally, like smoking and cholesterol. So my research then has allowed us to determine the specific social conditions that are capable of triggering physiological changes. And if these are experienced then persistently or chronically, they could lead to negative effects on health. And until we conduct this research that precisely characterizes these causal pathways, it's really difficult for us to know where to start in terms of interventions. And ultimately, I believe that this is the promise of this line of research, because it can pave the way for theoretically and empirically driven intervention studies that could ultimately improve health. So how could this happen then? Well, it's not likely that we can eliminate social stressors altogether. Unfortunately, stress is a part of life and it's going to happen. But what we might be able to do is reduce the impact of these social stressors on the body. So in other words, we might be able to break this chain and reduce or eliminate the physiological responses that could ultimately lead to these negative downstream health effects. So one way that we could do this is to teach relaxation techniques. So things like mindfulness meditation or yoga. And these, through empirical studies, have been shown to calm the mind and also reduce levels of cortisol and inflammation, which could lead to positive health benefits. Excuse me. But these types of interventions really require a great deal of time and resources. And in some cases, a solution might be as simple as simply reframing a stressor. So we conducted a study where we gave participants different goals prior to undergoing a laboratory stressor. So half of the participants, we told them to try to succeed on the task. And the other half of the participants, we told them to try not to fail. And what we found was that those given an approach-oriented goal to try to succeed, they actually had lower cortisol levels post-stressor compared to those given an avoidance goal of trying not to fail. So simply by providing a different goal or frame, we were able to reduce physiological responses to the same stressor. So I think that this has implications for how teachers frame tests, bosses frame assignments, and parents frame challenges for their children. And more broadly, I think that my research highlights the utility of the social ecological perspective for examining questions of stress and disease. So my work shows that the social context can fundamentally shape the psychological and biological stress responses, which could have implications for solving public health problems. Thank you.